Good evening. I would like to thank you all for coming here tonight to listen to this very important issue, Sharia-compliant finance and jihad with money. For those of you who attended Chris Holton's lecture last night at the Lux on global Islamic insurgency, you know what an informative evening you are in for. The good and the bad is that Chris is such an engaging speaker that you will smile while hearing what deep trouble we are in. We are so grateful to Chris for staying an extra day away from his family and home to educate us on yet another critical aspect of Islamic insurgency that is rarely spoken of and has already been quite integrated into our financial system. That is Sharia-compliant finance and jihad with money. Sharia-compliant finance is not just another financial product. Christopher Holton is Vice President of Outreach at the Center for Security Policy. He directs the Center's Divest Iran Initiative and Sharia Risk Due Diligence Program and has been involved in legislation in 20 states to divest taxpayer-supported pension systems from foreign companies that do business with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Sudan, and the Syrian Arab Republic. Since 2008, Chris has been editor-in-chief of the Sharia Finance Watch blog. In 2005, he was co-author of War Footing, published by the U.S. Naval Institute Press. Chris's work has been published by National Review, Human Events, The American Thinker, Family Security Matters, Big Piece, World Tribune, WorldNet Daily, Newsmax, and TheHayride.com. Before joining the center, Chris was president of Blanchard & Company, a $200 million per year investment firm, and editor-in-chief of the Blanchard Economic Research Unit. Christopher blogs at terrortrendsbulletin.com. He will take questions at the end of the presentation. I know that last night there were plenty of questions that people still wanted to ask. He will be happy to take them, and tonight nobody is going to kick us out. So that's the good thing. At this time, kindly turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices, and it is with great pleasure and honor that I give you Chris Holton of the Center for Security Policy.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. Thank you, Doris, once again for having me in your lovely home. It's great to be out here in LA. The weather was better yesterday than it was today, though, I'll tell you that much. We're going to talk tonight about Sharia-compliant finance. I know that that is a subject that has been on your minds for forever, probably. I'm not often called upon to talk on this subject. It's a rather obscure aspect of the threat that we face in Western civilization, but it's actually a very significant one. People's eyes tend to glaze over when you even start to talk about anything financial, and then when you couple it with Sharia, they really start to glaze over. So I appreciate the opportunity to do a little bit of education and outreach here on this subject matter. Sharia-compliant finance. Now, Sharia has been around for 14 centuries, roughly, in one form or another. But they didn't have stock markets and stuff back then. They didn't have bond markets. They didn't have financial systems. So how is Sharia-compliant finance, how does that work? How can these financial instruments and this financial system be embedded in a religious legal system, a religious political system, a religious military system, a religious social system, because that's all that Sharia is? How can it be embedded in something that old? Well, the fact of the matter is that Sharia-compliant finance is man-made, whereas pious Muslims consider Sharia to be Allah's law. Sharia-compliant finance cannot, I mean, they might say that it's investing according to Allah's principles, but I mean, that's just smoke and mirrors. The concept of Sharia-compliant finance has its origins going back to the 1940s. There's a guy named Maududi who was an Islamic scholar from India who worked his way to Pakistan, and he's very highly regarded in jihadi circles to this day. He did a lot of extensive writing. He was idolized by people like Osama bin Laden and many other people in the Muslim world. Maududi came up with a concept called Islamic economics in the 1940s. And the purpose of Islamic economics was to insulate and protect the Muslim world from the influence of Western colonial powers. The way Maududi looked at it was that the Western powers, particularly Great Britain, but others as well, had come into the Islamic world and through their wealth and power had essentially co-opted Islam in many ways and had transformed that world in a way that made people like Maududi very unhappy. So what he wanted to create was an insulated system of economics whereby Muslims would do business with each other according to Islamic principles and only do business with each other, kind of insulate themselves from the colonial powers. Now, obviously didn't really work. It didn't take off. I mean, Maududi wrote about it, but it didn't have any traction. At the time, the Islamic world was not powerful and was not particularly wealthy. I mean, there were some areas of the Islamic world that were wealthy, but it wasn't like today. So the concept, God bless you, the concept of Islamic economics kind of was toyed around with by Islamic scholars and intellectuals. For instance, Syed Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood intellectual who did a lot of writing in the 1940s and 1950s. He picked up on Maududi's concept, continued to write about it and develop it a little bit more, but again, there was no traction. No true system of Islamic economics really developed because there was too much money in doing business with the Westerners. So, and especially the British, they were everywhere in that part of the world. It wasn't until 1973, the Yom Kippur War and the subsequent Arab oil embargo, that resulted in the transformation of Islamic economics into what can properly be called Sharia-compliant finance. Because what happened then, of course, is that the price of oil went from, what, $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel in very short order, and then went up to $27 a barrel not too long after that. And all of a sudden you had a lot of people in the Middle East who were much wealthier than they had ever been. So they had a lot of money. So they could all of a sudden develop a system of economics. Except now, the purpose of Islamic economics was not to insulate the Muslim world from the intruding Western colonial powers, as Maududi had envisioned it. The purpose of Sharia-compliant finance was as an instrument of essentially Islamic imperialism. And that's what Sharia-compliant finance is today. The basic problem from a Western standpoint with Sharia-compliant finance is that the purpose of Sharia-compliant finance is to promote Sharia. And we've talked a little bit about Sharia last night. Sharia is the enemy threat doctrine. It is the code by which they operate. It is the goal that they have. Muslims seek to impose Sharia. We talked last night, if you recall, for those of you that were around last night, we talked about all the different jihadist groups in the world. All of them have the same goal, to establish either a global caliphate ruled by Sharia law or to establish an Islamic state in a country or a region ruled by Sharia law. Well, Sharia-compliant finance has that same goal, to establish Sharia law. You'll see Sharia-compliant finance referred to by some euphemisms. For instance, they'll call it Islamic finance or Islamic banking. That's a euphemism for Sharia-compliant finance. Now, why do they call it Islamic instead of Sharia? Because they know that Sharia has some bad implications for for Westerners. And people don't really know what Sharia is, but they know it's not good. So it's much more tidy and sanitary for a financial institution to refer to something as Islamic finance or Islamic banking than it is as Sharia-compliant finance or Sharia-compliant banking, which is what it is, because it complies with Sharia law, and it's Sharia scholars who make the rules. These are euphemisms that they use. An example of how Sharia-compliant finance is used to promote Sharia occurred a few years ago. Every year they have a meeting of the World Islamic Economic Forum. In fact, this past year they held it in London, the first time it was ever held in a country that is not predominantly Islamic. But this one year it was held in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. Incidentally, Malaysia in the Asian Pacific region is the center of Sharia-compliant finance. But they held the World Islamic Economic Forum there. And basically what it is a meeting of all the finance ministers of all the dictatorships and monarchies and other heinous regimes of Islamic countries from around the world, which, let's face it, that's what they all are. They come and they meet at the World Islamic Economic Forum with representatives of the Sharia-compliant financial community. And they have big powwows and probably breakouts and, you know, just like a big convention. Well, at the keynote address, or not the keynote address, but at the greeting address, the finance minister for Malaysia, you know, welcomed all the delegates and welcomed the industry and called upon the industry to continue its dawah operations. Now, dawah is essentially missionary operations in Islam, loosely translated. You know, if jihad is to spread Islam by the sword, dawah is to spread Islam by the pen and by financial means. So that revealed right there that the purpose of Sharia-compliant finance is to spread Sharia. That's the purpose of it. Just if there was no other problems, and there are other problems with Sharia-compliant finance, just that one fact alone would be enough to disqualify it, as far as I'm concerned. Because what we're doing here is, by allowing Sharia-compliant finance into the Western world, is we're bringing in a system that is inserting the enemy threat doctrine through our financial back door. And we would never do that under any other circumstances, but we have such a poor grasp of Islam and such a poor grasp of the nature of Sharia that we don't know how to deal with this stuff. We don't know how to deal with these things. So Sharia-compliant finance comes at us from a very vulnerable, comes at us in a very vulnerable point. Let's face it, it plays on our greed. And we live in a capitalist system, and greed plays a role in that system. And I don't mean greed as a negative thing in this particular instance, but they have the money. And a lot of people in the West look at this as an opportunity to get back some of the assets that we've been sending over to them to buy their oil. So they come here and they want to do Sharia-compliant financial transactions and stuff, and our people buy into it. When I say our people, the people on Wall Street, the people on Fleet Street. So that really started in earnest 1973 when the Islamic world, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, became very wealthy. Speaking of Iran, 1979, the Islamic Revolution occurs, the Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power, and Iran becomes much more powerful in the Islamic world and seeks to spread its Islamic revolution, including spreading Sharia-compliant finance. Not really intentionally and overtly, but just as a byproduct of the Islamic Revolution. To this day, Iran dominates the world of Sharia-compliant finance. This is not something that the industry likes to talk about. If you add up all of the Sharia-compliant financial assets under management in all of the Islamic countries around the world, they don't add up to the Sharia-compliant financial instruments under management in Iran. I mean, Iran dwarfs everybody else, even dwarfs Saudi Arabia. If you look at the list of the largest Sharia-compliant financial institutions in the world, and it's published every year in November by a British publication called The Banker. They have a whole issue every November devoted to Islamic finance. And you look at the top financial institutions, I think the last year that I checked, 6 of the top 10, including 2 of the top 3, including the top 1, largest financial institution in the world that's Sharia compliant are Iranian state-owned banks, which until very recently were all under US and European Union sanctions for being involved in things like funding terrorism and handling transactions in support of Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missile program. These are 2 of the top 3 Sharia-compliant financial institutions of the world are examples of that. And that right there should tell you something. Now, one of the aspects of Sharia-compliant finance that the industry likes to talk about is that it's a form of ethical investing. They don't invest in alcohol or tobacco or weapons. They don't invest in other things that they don't really like to talk about. For instance, if you're a company that's based out of Israel, for instance, chances are they're not going to invest in your company. They don't invest in pork products or in anybody that deals in pork products, things like that. So they actually market these products to non-Muslims based on this is a form of ethical investing. You can avoid pornography and alcohol and all those bad things. But there's the other side to that, because these financial institutions that I just mentioned are all involved directly in funding jihadist terrorism. All these Iranian institutions, I mean, this isn't a matter for debate even. We'll get into the greater aspects of possible terrorism funding associated with Sharia-compliant finance, but this one is a no-brainer. It's an Iranian state-owned bank. Iran is the most active sponsor of jihadist terrorism in the world. These banks are already under sanctions for that activity. And if you pick up the November copy of The Banker and look in there, they're listed right there. That is an example of a problem in the industry. You can't call an industry ethical when the biggest institutions that make up that industry fund people who carry out atrocities. Can't do it. So, you know, there's a problem there. As the Islamic world has grown wealthy, they've developed Sharia-compliant finance more and more over time, to where now it's a significant factor in the world markets. When I first started covering Sharia-compliant finance in late 2008, I think there was about $800 billion of Sharia-compliant financial institutions outside of Iran. Now there's 1.3 trillion, so it's grown, and they project that it's going to grow more. You know, here's the thing. There was a time when wealthy Muslims had no problem investing in conventional instruments. But now that Sharia-compliant instruments have come along, they won't invest in those conventional instruments. So they've become a tool of Islamic imperialism, because it's all about making us play by their rules. So when a wealthy Saudi wants to invest in something He insists that it be Sharia compliant. So you're seeing Sharia compliant financial instruments crop up in the West in order to attract that money. The process of doing that, we're letting Sharia in, folks. We are abiding by Sharia. We are complying with Sharia in order to get that money. And we can say, well, it won't go any further. But Sharia is not a smorgasbord. It's not something that you pick and choose from. It's a code of life that they follow. And this is, you've heard about the camel's nose under the tent. This is the camel's nose under the tent with an exponent. It's a serious problem. The basic fundamental problem with Sharia compliant finance, of course, is the fact that it promotes Sharia. If you look at some of the details, though, of Sharia compliant finance, you can say that the problems with Sharia compliant financial institutions and instruments are that there is no standard of disclosure when it comes to key aspects of Sharia compliant finance that are of material interest to investors. Nobody knows how to deal with this stuff. So there's no standards of disclosure. You might find one instrument that has certain things that are disclosed, then you find another product that has almost nothing disclosed. And the thing is, these aspects involving Sharia, there's no requirement in U.S. securities regulations that there be this disclosure. It's not covered. It's kind of outside of the whole realm. It's basically true for Europe as well, where Sharia compliant finance is much more evolved than it is here. Right from the get-go. If you look at the prospectuses for these various Sharia compliant financial instruments and funds and Islamic bonds known as sukuk and what have you, there's never any proper disclosure of the nature of Sharia. In some cases, if you look in the prospectus, they don't even mention it. In some cases, they'll just say something like, the fund invests according to Islamic principles. And that's it. No explanation whatsoever. It is absolutely of material interest to investors, especially in the United States, what Sharia is. It has to be disclosed. It should be disclosed. I was in the presence of a Sharia scholar at Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School was way on board with Sharia compliant finance. A wealthy Saudi and few wealthy Muslims gave Harvard a lot of money, and they established a whole Islamic finance department at Harvard Law School, and occasionally they'll have seminars there. And I went to one, I think it was in 2009. My brother graduated from Harvard. I wasn't nearly smart enough to go to Harvard. And that's the first time I had visited there. And I got there and I was so glad I didn't go to school there. I felt like I was on Mars. We're sitting in there and it's 2 days of, I could barely control myself. And it was in this big auditorium, and they were talking about the Muslim Brotherhood like it was the Boy Scouts. It was just on and on and on and on and on. So finally, there were a couple people that were asking questions, and there was a Sharia scholar there, and somebody asked him, what is Sharia? And this was his answer. It's the path on which we walk. So that's kind of the level of disclosure. What the hell does that mean? In financial circles, that is no disclosure. That's just gobbledygook. But that was his answer. And everybody at Harvard Law School said, ooh. I'm like, what is going on here? These are the best and the brightest? What is going on? So there's never any proper disclosure of the true nature of Sharia. That's a problem. That should have to be disclosed. Who determines whether a financial institution or an instrument or a product is Sharia compliant. It's done by Sharia scholars. And this is a whole other aspect to this thing that gets into some real disturbing stuff. The Sharia scholars sometimes aren't properly disclosed. Is there something beeping? Am I doing something wrong? Okay. The Sharia scholars, there's very few of them for one thing. But generally speaking, they'll try to get like 3 Sharia scholars to evaluate the institution or the products in some way to declare them Sharia compliant. Almost invariably, these Sharia scholars are male. Almost invariably, they're from foreign countries, from just a few countries: Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt. Very often, because there's so few qualified Sharia scholars. I mean, there's a lot of Sharia scholars out there, but most of them can't add 2 plus 2, much less, advise a financial institution. So the universe of Sharia scholars who can even talk in financial terms is very small. So what you end up with is a lot of conflicts of interest, which go completely ignored in this industry for some reason. It would never happen in any other industry. But, you have a Sharia scholar who's on the board, a Sharia advisory board for one financial institution, and then he'll be on the Sharia advisory board for that financial institution's biggest competitor. And maybe he'll be on the Sharia advisory board for all the financial institutions in that industry. I mean, how does that work? I mean, that would never fly in the real world, as they say. But it happens over and over again in the Sharia-compliant financial industry. And they've actually acknowledged that that's a problem. But they don't really know what to do about it, because it's not like people are just popping out new Sharia scholars who can be conversant in economics. So it's a problem for them. So basically what it is that these 3 Sharia scholars will advise the board, the actual board of the institution, on its Sharia compliance on a regular basis to make sure that everything is copacetic. They have a lot of duties beyond just rubber stamping things. One of the things that they advise on is the distribution of zakat. And here's where we get into some real problems. Zakat, as I think we talked a little bit about last night, is a form of tithing in Islam. It's one of the pillars of Islam, and it's every Muslim who is able to is supposed to tithe 1/40 of his wealth every year to zakat. And the same is true of institutions and certain Sharia-compliant financial products. That works a little bit differently. I mean, if the overall institution won't necessarily have to donate to zakat, but maybe a portion of the assets of some of its underlying products will be donated to zakat. In other cases, the entire institution has to donate to zakat. Depends on the structure of that institution. For instance, Citibank. Overall, Citibank is not Sharia compliant. So Citibank doesn't donate to zakat, but Citibank's got some Sharia compliant products and some Sharia compliant divisions, and they do have to tithe. Whereas a institution in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar, that institution itself would probably also tithe as an institution in addition to a portion of its assets under management. But here's the thing about zakat that's so worrisome, is that there are 8 known destinations for zakat. 8 permissible destinations for zakat. And I brought back tonight my 2 textbooks on Sharia to review the acceptable destinations for zakat. And this first book, Reliance of the Traveler, which was written several hundred years ago, has been endorsed by Al-Azhar University and many other Islamic authorities in the Islamic world. And on page 772, or 272 rather, it gives the 8 destinations for zakat, and the 7th destination for zakat is those fighting for Allah. Then it defines it. The 7th category is those fighting for Allah, meaning people engaged in Islamic military operations for whom no salary has been allotted in the army roster. Who does that sound like? But who are volunteers for jihad without remuneration. There's that word again, jihad. I don't think they mean inner struggle here, just a hunch. They are given enough to suffice them for the operation, even if affluent. Sounds a lot like somebody we used to know. Of weapons, mounts, clothing, and expenses for the duration of the journey, round trip, and the time they spend there, even if prolonged. Though nothing has been mentioned here of the expense involved in supporting such people's families during this period, it seems clear that they should also be given it. So they also support families of jihadis with zakat money, which is how Saddam Hussein got into supporting families of suicide bombers through, he was just following Islamic law. Islamic law says they have to do this. So there's, Reliance of the Traveler, the 7th destination for zakat. Now, some people will criticize Reliance of the Traveler unjustifiably by saying that it's several hundred years old and it's outdated. So we've got a summary of Islamic jurisprudence published in Saudi Arabia in 2005. The latest edition came out in 2012, and that's what we have here. And we'll see how much Sharia has evolved over 700 years. The 7th category is that spent in the cause of Allah, such as that given to warriors who volunteer in fighting for the cause of Allah, and they do not take salaries from the public treasury of Muslims. Generally, the phrase, the cause of Allah, refers to the war against the enemies of Muslims, as Allah exalted be, he says, indeed, Allah loves those who fight in his cause. So, if anything, they've gotten more direct about it. 2 books on the same subject written 700 years apart. So, we know that zakat can go to jihad. Generally speaking, the way the zakat is distributed from Islamic financial institutions is through Islamic charities. And I actually spoke to a guy with a hedge fund who had a Sharia-compliant hedge fund as part of the hedge funds that they had. And I don't even remember the guy's name. But I asked him, I said, what do you all do about zakat? Of course, he had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, well, what about your due diligence on this stuff? And he said to me, we've done our due diligence on Shariah. And I said, really? You've done your due diligence on Shariah, huh? He said, yeah. I said, glad to hear it. I mean, let me tell you, I think the level of due diligence on Wall Street and in Greenwich, Connecticut on this stuff is, how much money can I make? Okay, let's go. I think that's the due diligence. So we know that Islamic charities have been implicated in funding terrorism. The 3 largest Islamic charities in the United States were all shut down for funding terrorism. We talked about that last night. And in addition to those 3, there are 24 others in the U.S. and Great Britain that have been named or implicated by either U.S. or British authorities as funding terrorism as well. Then add on top of that the Union of Good, which is kind of like the United Way for the Islamic world, which is a umbrella group of 53 Islamic charities, which has been designated by the U.S. Treasury Department as a terrorist entity for funding jihad. So, I mean, that's no fewer than 80 Islamic charities that we know about are funding jihad. We know that Islamic law says that they're at least permitted, depending on which school of Sharia that you follow. Some schools will let you split it up according to the way that you want. Other schools say, no, you have to split it up between all 8. But it's the Sharia scholars who make these decisions, and they're not real interested in sharing with the rest of the world how they come about these decisions. This is not a fantasy. This is not a fantasy. This happened. From 1988 to 2001, there was a bank that was based out of the Bahamas called Bank El-Taqwa. And the chair of the Sharia Advisory Board of Bank El-Taqwa was a guy named Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi. Some of you may recognize his name. He's probably the foremost Sunni Sharia scholar in the world. He was kicked out of Egypt by Mubarak 30 years ago, settled in Qatar, which incidentally is a really bad country. I mean, they ostensibly our ally, but they're really bad. So they gave safe haven to Qaradawi for all these years. And he was the chief of the Sharia Advisory Board of Bank El-Taqwa, which was operating in conjunction with a Sharia-compliant real estate firm out of northern New Jersey named BMI. Turns out that they were skimming money and sending it to one of seven different jihadist groups, including Ayman al-Zawahiri's forerunner of Al-Qaeda, because Zawahiri had an organization called the Islamic Group in Egypt before he joined with bin Laden in Al-Qaeda, and Qaradawi was funding that through Bank El-Taqwa, and it was shut down by the U.S., and even the United Nations designated it a terrorist entity. Now, you know, for the UN to designate it a terrorist entity, you talk about moving heaven and earth. I mean, what could have possibly possessed them to have designated a terrorist entity? Now, all right, so Sheikh Qaradawi. Remember I mentioned the Union of Good? Guess who is the chair of the Union of Good? Sheikh Qaradawi, same guy. And he was on the board of several financial institutions in the West. He's not really on the board of any financial institutions in the West anymore, but he's the chair of the Sharia Advisory Board for all of the big banks in Qatar. I believe he's the chair of the Sharia Advisory Board for the big Sharia-compliant banks in Bahrain. He's getting kind of old now, so he's not as active in that realm, and he's a very creepy guy. In fact, I call him Creepy Qaradawi. He is banned from traveling to the U.S. and Britain and now France completely. He's on the board in absentia of several of the big Islamic organizations here in the United States. He's banned from coming here, so he can't attend any of the board meetings, but like the Islamic Circle of North America, I think, it's in your handout, and a few of the other big organizations. I mean, he's on their boards here in the United States, and this guy's banned from traveling here because of his ties to extremists. I don't like that word, but that's the official line. The reason he's banned is because of his ties to extremists. So Qaradawi is one of the most prominent figures in the Sharia-compliant financial world. And he's got known ties to terrorism. And in fact, even though he's not taking on so much of a prominent role now, Sharia-compliant finance would not be what it is today if not for his pioneering work back when it was really getting started after the Arab oil embargo. I mean, he was very much involved for years and years before that. So those are the types of roles that these Sharia scholars play. There's another Sharia scholar that we are very interested in. Mufti Taqi Usmani. He's a former member of the Pakistani Supreme Court. He kind of retired from that and cashed in and went into the Sharia-compliant financial industry. He's former chairman of the Dow Jones Sharia Advisory Board. He's a former chairman of HSBC's Sharia Advisory Board. I bet you didn't even know Dow Jones had a Sharia Advisory Board, huh? They do.
Established in 1998.
Yeah, and he was the chair of HSBC's Sharia Advisory Board as well. He's not anymore, and the reason he's not anymore is because the Wall Street Journal, which was owned by Dow Jones at the time, I mean, they're both still together, but they're owned by News Corp now. But at the time, they weren't owned by News Corp. But at the time, Investors Business Daily did an expose on Usmani and pointed out that Dow Jones, their competitor, the chair of their Sharia Advisory Board, was this guy with ties to the Taliban and who had written really horrible, hateful books. And it took a while, but they finally kicked him off the board of the Dow Jones Islamic Index Fund. HSBC was not as quick to act. They hesitated. They didn't do anything for a long time. Some people pointed out that Usmani had written a book called Islam and Modernity, which basically had all kinds of really hateful things about the West in there. In that book, he actually said he instructed Muslims living in the Western world to pretend like they were friends with non-Muslims until they were strong enough to rise up in jihad. That was his advice for them. You know, this guy's on the board of like all kinds of financial institutions in the West, and he's writing this stuff. And this stuff's not hard to find. I mean, it's been translated into English in his case. And a simple Google search, you know, if they had done any due diligence on this guy, if they had had any desire to do any due diligence on this guy, they'd have found out that he was a really bad guy. And then he wrote a book, you know, What is Christianity? Which was, I mean, it may have, it was like, it would be considered hate speech in some countries in the West, in terms of, you know, what he said about Christianity and Christians. But on top of that, shortly after 9/11, he led a delegation of Sharia scholars into Afghanistan, ostensibly to talk Mullah Omar into giving up Osama bin Laden. But what they found out later was that actually when he went in and saw Mullah Omar, they all told him, hold your ground, don't give him up to the infidels. Just the opposite of what they were sent in there to do. Turns out that Usmani's family owns and operates and has for generations a madrasa in Pakistan. Just happens to be the madrasa where the Taliban were hatched years ago. So this is a really bad guy who was on the chair, who was the chair of the HSBC Advisory Board. They finally kicked him off. And who do you think they replaced him with? His son. I mean, that's one of the most cynical displays that I've seen, you know, in this whole realm. I mean, we are our own worst enemy. I mean, HSBC was fined like $1 billion 2 years ago for essentially looking the other way while people were doing business with Iran. I mean, they got caught red-handed doing that, and they got fined $1 billion. And they ended up hiring a guy who was with the Treasury Department, who was in charge of trying to uncover terrorist financing. But you know, when one of my heroes, David Yerushalmi, met with that guy to talk to him about Sharia-compliant finance, he had no clue as what Sharia was. much less Sharia-compliant finance, when he was with the Treasury Department. And Yerushalmi tried to explain the whole thing to him, and the guy's name is Levy, and he responded, he said, I don't know what Sharia is, but I know it can't be what you're saying it is. That's kind of the attitude. Well, HSBC hired this guy to put them in compliance. Well, we know this guy doesn't have a concern about Sharia-compliant finance. In fact, we know that the Treasury Department does not have a concern about Sharia-compliant finance, because in November of 2008, just after the election and while Bush was still in office, they held a seminar promoting Sharia-compliant finance at the Treasury Department building, just steps away from the White House. And it was presided over by a guy named Sheikh Yusuf de Lorenzo. Interesting character. He's one of the Sharia scholars. He now lives in Dubai, but he was originally from Massachusetts. He grew up a Catholic in Massachusetts, and he turned 18 and he went to Cornell, the college. And he was there less than a year, and he dropped out, and like everybody else, he moved to Pakistan and to find himself. And he converted to Islam, probably before he went to Pakistan, I'd guess. And he ended up becoming a Sharia scholar. He worked for General Zia al-Haq, who essentially is responsible for the train wreck that Pakistan is today through an Islamization process. And this guy was one of his chief advisors. He came back to the United States eventually and became the Sharia advisor to many different financial institutions. He's still a very popular Sharia advisor for financial institutions here in the U.S., even though he's relocated to Dubai. He was also the dean of something, or dean of academics at the Islamic Saudi Academy in Northern Virginia. Does that ring any bells? The Islamic Saudi Academy in Northern Virginia was the academy where they had textbooks that were saying that, you know, Christians and Jews are descended from apes and pigs and all that other stuff. You remember when that was going on a few years ago? Well, De Lorenzo, who's one of the prominent Sharia scholars in this industry, was dean of academics there at the time. I mean, so he was in charge of all that. He was responsible for it. So we've got these kind of characters. There's no real disclosure in any of the literature for any of this stuff, if you look in there, about zakat. Sometimes they disclose it, sometimes they don't. They don't really say where it's going. They don't. They say it's part of the ethical investing that they have to give to charities. They usually don't say which charities they're giving it to. In some cases, they don't mention it at all. There's no disclosure about the Sharia scholars usually. Sometimes there is. Usually it's like a 3-word bio. Sometimes they don't even mention that they have a Sharia advisory board. Sometimes they'll say there is a Sharia advisory board, but they won't say anything else about it. They'll just mention that there is one. So the standards of disclosure for the industry are just all over the map. I mean, it's pretty much do whatever you want. And I guess if I was a crass member of the financial community, I would say, well, if they're not going to make me disclose it, I'm not going to disclose it. I'm going to tell them as little as I can about this. But you can see that these are of material interest to people. And they're marketing this stuff to non-Muslims, especially in Europe, where they market it as ethical investing. But they're starting to do that over here, too, to some extent. Not really that successful at it over here, but give them time. So this is a growing sector of the financial system, and it's promoting our enemy's threat doctrine. And there are many specific aspects about it for which there's not good disclosure, that if we insisted that they provide the proper level of disclosure, it would probably discourage them from even operating over here. If you had to disclose the true nature of Sharia in detail, if you had to disclose the true nature of zakat and where the zakat was going, it might at least prevent it from going to terrorist entities, because right now, nobody knows where that stuff goes. You think Qaradawi's going to tell anybody where he's sending that stuff? Think Usmani's son at HSBC is going to listen to this new guy that they hired to be their regulator guy, their compliance guy? He's not going to care. So if we could force that on them, and we have stacks and stacks of regulations on the financial industry, and there's nothing on this stuff. Nothing. Zero. No regulation on it whatsoever. Something that needs to be addressed. Don't expect it to be addressed anytime soon. And even under the Republican administration, the Treasury Department, we're essentially cheerleaders for this stuff. So when you're fighting Wall Street and you're fighting the government, it's an uphill battle. But that's essentially the state of affairs when it comes to Sharia-compliant finance. It's kind of a primer. At this point, I'll answer any questions you've got, but that pretty much concludes my prepared statement. Sure.
Is there Sharia-compliant real estate transactions?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. BMI was a Sharia-compliant real estate company in northern New Jersey that was involved with Bank El Taqwa in funding Jihad, if you recall that I mentioned that. But yes, there are. Here's the thing. They have Sharia-compliant mortgages and Sharia-compliant loans and stuff. And, they're not supposed to charge interest. So they don't charge interest. They charge fees. And the one thing about Sharia-compliant mortgages and Sharia-compliant loans, almost invariably, they're much more expensive than conventional loans. And they're much more difficult to figure out, and the level of disclosure is not there. And another thing, that in some cases, it's amazing that their fees seem to fluctuate kind of like with interest rates. But they don't call it interest. It's convoluted. They concoct these systems to get around it. And so that's, probably a big aspect of the real estate industry. Now, there's also a lot of Sharia compliance in real estate development. For instance, Qatar is involved in a big real estate development in downtown Washington, D.C. that is supposed to be Sharia compliant. And some of the things that they're talking about is that, probably not going to be a heavenly ham in there. Probably not going to be a Christian Science bookstore.
A wine shop.
Yeah, probably not going to be a liquor store, that kind of thing. So.
But I had heard that that if a Muslim buys a piece of property, they can only resell it to another Muslim.
I have not heard that.
Oh.
I don't know that to be true. I'm not saying that it isn't true, but I haven't heard it.
Because that would be...
I think, that may be true in some parts of the world. In parts of the world where there's majority Muslim population, that may be a requirement under Sharia. But over here, it may not be a requirement simply because in some cases under Sharia, there's a doctrine that says that they can relax certain aspects of Sharia to deal with the practical reality. And if for instance, if you're the imam of the Islamic Center of Daphne, Alabama, and you got to sell your house, you might have a long time to wait for a Muslim to come along and buy it. So it may not apply in some places like it does in others. So, sure. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you mentioned Harvard Law School. I just wanted to make a point that there are 50% of the law schools in the United States. 100 law schools offer a course on Sharia. And right now it's elective, but who knows what it'll be in the future. I had a question about SAR, the raid in 2003, Operation Green Quest.
Yeah.
Now, that was part of Safa Trust. Supposedly SAR was shut down. Very few people, if any, were prosecuted for Operation Green Quest. But I see SAFA is still very much in business. SAR was ostensibly shut down by the FBI, but is that really the case? Don't they just
it probably
pop up with
morphed.
another entity?
Yes, and that is in fact happening with the Holy Land Foundation too. Now, all the officers of the Holy Land Foundation were put in jail, but the remnants of the Holy Land Foundation are now popping up as something else, and that definitely happened in the case of SAR, and it's probably going to happen in the case of Holy Land Foundation. That absolutely is the case. It's a real good point. They don't just quit they'll come back as something else. I mean, they're like a starfish.
All right, that was 2003. Why couldn't we get some prosecutions out of that one?
I can't answer that. I just don't know.
I can't get an answer from the FBI either.
Well, I mean, look, what about all the unindicted co-conspirators in the Hoyland Foundation trial that the Dallas U.S. Attorney's Office had the intention of going after, then Eric Holder comes into office and shuts all that stuff down. I mean, there's another example right there. I mean, they had the goods on a lot of these unindicted co-conspirators, and they were absolutely intending to go after, especially NATE, North American Islamic Trust, which would have been a big get. And Eric Holder essentially just shut it down. So, anybody else? Yes, sir.
I think most people are probably familiar with the Franklin funds, Franklin Templeton. I wanted to mention that earlier this year they listed several Sharia-compliant Islamic funds. Most people probably don't know about that. But one interesting thing you mentioned was this sort of Islamic charity and how it's used for terrorism. Is it safe to conclude from your remarks that Citigroup is funding Jihad?
Well,
is that overly simplistic?
That's probably overly simplistic. I mean, you'd have a tough time proving it. Citigroup has Sharia-compliant products and divisions. There's no question in order for them to be Sharia-compliant, there's got to be a zakat mechanism in there somewhere. And we know that zakat has 8 acceptable destinations, usually through Islamic charities. We know that Islamic charities very often fund jihad. Now, in some schools of Islamic law, they don't have to fund all 8. They can select the ones that they want to fund. In other schools of Islamic law, they do have to fund all 8. So it's not guaranteed that they're funding jihad, but it's been shown to have happened in the past, and the mechanism exists there. Then if you ask them what the due diligence they've done on it, my guess is that they're going to give you some kind of baloney answer that they don't really know.
I just want to follow up and just ask you, most socially conscious investment funds and most Sharia funds that I've looked at really don't have stellar performance. Do you see any crossover buying where those people who are non-Muslim are investing in these sorts of products as well, or is it? Not
so much over here, but they're definitely marketing them in Great Britain to non-Muslim investors. And they claim, this all goes back to the whole thing of disclosure. And they make claims all the time in the media and in speeches, when I say they, members of the Sharia financial industry, they'll make claims all the time that they have better performance and that they are insulated from the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, which incidentally is complete balderdash, because if you actually look at look at Dubai as an example. I mean, who was hit harder than Dubai by that crisis? And that's supposed to be, one of the big entities that it brought down was supposed to be Sharia compliant. So that's just balderdash. But the whole business of not charging interest on loans, happens in Great Britain a lot. I haven't seen it over here, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's happening over here. They'll claim that they have interest-free loans. They'll advertise them in Great Britain as interest-free to try to attract non-Muslim money. Interest-free. That means something different than we don't charge interest, we charge something else. They call it interest-free, and they give people the impression that they're giving away free money, which of course is, nobody gives away free money. But they advertise them as interest-free, and you'll see them refer to their products as interest-free all the time in interviews and stuff like that. Stuff that a officer of a U.S. Financial institution, if he was interviewed in the Wall Street Journal and he made a mistake like that, he would probably try to get a retraction. Or his compliance office would be tearing their hair out and saying, "Why would you say something so stupid?" But the way these guys say it all the time, they don't care, and they know that nobody's watching them. So, disappoints me to hear that Franklin Templeton's into it now, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, sooner or later, everybody's going to be into it. That's just the way it works.
Thank you.
Sir? Yes, sir?
Do you have any comments about Ali bin Talal and his, he's been in...
Oh, yeah. He owns part of News Corp and,
Right,
yeah.
Fox News.
He's one of the guys that gave money to Harvard Law School and to Georgetown, you know, for Harvard. He funded Harvard Law School's Sharia Finance Division, Islamic Finance Division, and he also played a large role in funding Georgetown's. I forget the name of that. They have an entity at Georgetown which is like the Prince Talal Center for Interfaith Understanding or
Christian
something like,
Muslim.
yeah, something like that. And it's run by a guy, what's his name?
John Esposito.
Esposito.
Karen Armstrong, I think it's part of that.
God.
He also arranged the trip for Harvard Law School right before Barack Obama enrolled in Harvard Law School. They brought over all these Harvard Law muckety-mucks to Saudi Arabia. First donation the Saudi government gave. 6 months later, Barack Obama enrolled there. Just a coincidence, I'm sure.
Wow, I bet I didn't know. Yeah, I mean, look, it's all about the money. And they throw around the money, and we play the game because we want the money. When I say we, I mean the West and the United States. You know, Talal, when they were having those riots in France, you remember they were having riots in France, and they had youths that were burning cars, and they'd have a count every night on the news. Tonight there were 127 cars burned across France, and last night there was only 70. You know, and literally there was like a score card for cars being burned. Well, someone on Fox News pointed out that these youths were Muslims, and you know, he, as a big investor in News Corp, came down and said, you can't refer to them as Muslims. This has nothing to do with Islam, which there's a lot of evidence that it had everything to do with Islam. And then he bragged about the fact that he got Fox News to change its what it was saying at the time about it, that they started to refer to them simply as youths, and they quit making the connection to Islam. And he was bragging that he was able to have that influence. And you know, it's a problem when they start to throw their money at our media. I mean, you could make the case that we have very little in the way of independent media already, but when you know the Muslims come in and start throwing money at it, it creates a whole series of much greater problems than we already have. If a wealthy Saudi sheikh can come in and tell Fox News what to say and what not to say, and Fox News is supposed to be the good guys, I mean, where does that put us? Not a good situation at all. Your follow-up? Yes, sir?
Well, the follow-up is your discussion last night was with Al-Moody and under the table sort of giving money to various people, and I would call it a conduit. Al-Moody was a conduit, maybe
Okay.
Bin Talal also is, but in a way, I kind of like to get a little bit back to politics, but it's basically related to the finance, because I'm very curious as to why Michelle Bachmann was shut up so effectively by John McCain, of all people.
Yeah.
Now,
And Boehner, too. Don't
Yes,
forget
now,
Boehner.
I'm wondering,
And Rubio, Marco Rubio.
is there a
he-
conduit here? What's going on?
Shut up about what?
Well, what happened was, it wasn't just Michelle Bachmann. She was kind of like the face of it, but there was a few different members of the House of Representatives who wrote letters to the inspectors general for several departments of the federal government, asking them to look into the possibility that there may be influence operations being conducted by the Muslim Brotherhood. And one of the aspects of that was the fact that Abedin, for example, whose whole family is Muslim Brotherhood, was chief of staff to the Secretary of State. And how did a person like that get through a security clearance? That kind of thing. Congressman Louis Gohmert was part of that. He was one of the co-signers of that letter as well. The left likes to pick on Michelle Bachmann, so they made her the lightning rod, so to speak. And you're right. It wasn't just the left that went after her for making this making this request, because there was no accusation. There was no accusation in the letter. It was merely a request of inspectors general to look into this as a possibility. And John McCain and John Boehner and Marco Rubio, all three leapt to the defense of Abedin and essentially called it a witch hunt. McCain is real close friends with Hillary, so that might have had something to do with what he was doing. Boehner's just weak. I mean Boehner's just, he's terrible. He's terrible.
McCain is also the chairman of the International Republican Institute. And during the Arab Spring in Egypt, he sent an envoy, Jesse Gallus, and Lindsey Graham is also on that board, to Egypt to help the Muslim Brotherhood win the elections. So we know what side he's on.
Yeah, and then he clearly was intervening on behalf of Al-Qaeda in Libya and wanted to intervene on behalf of Al-Qaeda in Syria. But, I don't know what Rubio's deal was, but those three, did exactly what you said. I don't have an answer for you. I'm sorry. I don't know what their motivation was. Yeah, it was peculiar. It was. And of course, those letters have gone unanswered, essentially. The letters that were written asking for the inspectors general to look into this. So very unfortunate. Yes, ma'am.
So you can't prove if it's true or not true, because there was something that we read on the internet about that, and that wouldn't kill her campaign if it's true that her chief of staff is part of the Muslim Brotherhood?
Oh, look, Andrew McCarthy has broken the code on that, and the gentleman back here, Mr. Johnson's done a lot of work on it. It's out there. The problem is that it's part of the whole Clinton Teflon. I mean, it's like nothing sticks to them.
Puma was the bag woman for them with the Arab money. I mean, she literally went and connected the Clintons to governments, which then gave the money to the Clinton Library, and. None of that, when they were having when the Anthony Weiner story broke, where'd they go? They went to Qatar. They went to UAE. I mean, it's pretty bad.
Yeah.
What do you think of Peter King? Is he
he's the chair of the, which Homeland Security, or which committee is he chair of? I like him. I like him. But look, I work on the state level. I haven't been to Washington, D.C. since January of 2012. I try to avoid Washington as much as possible. So, I mean, I'm not the guy to ask about, various congressmen, I mean, I know nothing more about them than anybody,
he just seems to be more straightforward about, calling out these entities.
Well, I mean, he also, he held hearings on what was termed radicalization. I don't really like that word. But he held hearings and took a lot of heat for holding hearings about, all that stuff, which I thought was, a good idea. It may not have ended up being executed as forcefully as it might have been, but I think it was a good idea to hold those hearings. We should be having more hearings on these things.
So let me ask you, we have various groups, like the SEC, whose job is to regulate, maybe that's the answer right now.
Yeah.
Whose job it is to regulate financial markets and instruments anyway, make sure they follow certain requirements and so forth. So I gather from what you're saying is that Sharia law, Sharia finance, where the money goes, that's not really on their radar. Not
on their radar. It's been pointed out to them, but there's no evidence that they've taken any action in any way. And the Treasury Department has been a cheerleader for Islamic finance. And the SEC is part of the Treasury Department. The thing is, policy is people. And right now, you've got people in charge that have no incentive to go after this stuff. I mean, it's not going to happen right now.
Is
Just
this
didn't.
supposedly, a really politically correct, hands across the sea kind of attitude that they think they're presenting to the Arab world?
It's probably part of it, but I think most of it is just, look, the people that come in and out of the SEC are also people in the financial industry. And, I mean, they want things like this. I mean, they don't want to put obstacles in the way of commerce or the world of finance, and they might see it as putting an obstacle in the way of this.
Even though they know there's a connection between Sharia finance and financing terrorism.
Oh, I don't know that they know it.
That's scary.
Oh yeah, but look, one of the things I failed to mention last night that I thought I'd mention was, we talked about the Holy Land Foundation trial last night and all the unindicted co-conspirators and how all that worked, where they found the memorandum and used it in the trial. Remember, we talked about that for those of you that were here last night. You talk to most FBI agents, they've never heard of the Holy Land Foundation trial. They have no idea that it even happened. They have no idea. So I would apply that same principle to our financial regulators. They don't know any of this stuff. This is so far off their radar screen. Are you kidding me? They can't spell Sharia. I mean, there's nobody watching this stuff. Yeah, right. There's nobody watching this stuff. It's just not happening. There's nobody watching. I mean, there is a division at the Treasury Department that's supposed to look into terrorism financing. They don't look at this aspect of it. They don't. And a lot of that is out of political correctness. They don't want to just look at things that are Islamic and assume that, there's something bad going on. So they don't look. Yes, sir?
Back to me again. Let's bring Jimmy Carter in on this.
He's no longer the worst president of my lifetime.
He's a very big supporter of the Palestinians, and I'm wondering, are there any, and he must have his own library, but is there any evidence of any conduits going to him through?
Oh yeah, I mean, his library was well funded by the Saudis and all that. Absolutely, absolutely, plenty money. And then my guess is that if you looked at Habitat for Humanity when he was involved with them, they're probably getting money from him too. There's always money there, always.
How far does this go back? Does it go back to Nixon or?
FDR.
Yeah, Eisenhower met with Saeed Ramadan in the Oval
Yeah, look,
Office.
Steve Emerson wrote a book about it. The U.S. House of Saud or something like that. It was one of his early books. It details the history of it. That's a good book to read for the historical perspective on the relationship. But it definitely goes back to FDR. Yes, ma'am?
We say American betrayal.
Is there something that can be done about it, and if so, what?
Yeah, good question. Well, about all we can do at this point is try to have our elected leaders know that this stuff is important to us. And that, because when I talk to state representatives and state senators, they never hear from people on this stuff. And to the extent that I've talked to congressional staff and a few congressmen, a few senators, the ones who are interested in this are interested in it of their own initiative. It's not because they're hearing from constituents on it. And I don't just mean Sharia-compliant finance. I mean the whole threat from Sharia and Jihad. They hear from constituents on Obamacare and pocketbook issues and things like that. Tea Party gets worked up about stuff, and they hear from the Tea Party on things. They don't hear from constituents on this. It'd be great if constituents would communicate with their elected officials about this stuff. I mean, I met with, when the last time I was in Washington, I met with, he was a congressman at the time, Alan West, about Sharia-compliant finance. And he ended up writing a op-ed for Investors Business Daily about it, coming out of that meeting. But he's not there anymore. I mean, he was somebody that was fired up about it, and I think he would have, tried to get somebody to look into it, but he's not there anymore. So what can be done? I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you. I mean, that sounds so lame. But in reality, I mean, I've been working on this specific issue since 2008. Before that, I was working on Iran divestment, and I thought we were making progress there. And then a few weeks ago, Barack Obama wrapped that in debt court and blew it in place. So now, I mean, all that work is down the drain. It's hard not to feel disheartened at times. It just we can't give up.
Where's the president on this?
Where's the president on this?
Press.
Oh, the press. Well, it depends on which press you're talking about. I can promise you that the Wall Street Journal isn't real interested in this because Dow Jones has a Sharia entity. I mean, they're part of the problem. Reuters is a huge operator in the Sharia-compliant financial industry. So, I mean, there's a lot of them have a vested interest in this industry, so you don't get much play in the press on this, unfortunately. Every once in a while you get a column written by somebody in a conservative publication pointing out that this is a concern, but you won't see anybody in the regular media. I mean, I was on the Glenn Beck program on TV talking about it. There's been a few columns written in Human Events and National Review about this, and Investors Business Daily has looked into it a couple of times, like I mentioned, but other than that, the media, this is so obscure. I mean, it's very obscure. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that it is so obscure. And I mean,
It shouldn't be.
Well, I know, but
The Muslims have a saying, sit down at your doorstep and you will see the corpse of your enemy
come by.
taken by.
Yeah.
It's just they don't have to do anything. They just have to sit down and wait.
Right.
And we are sitting down and waiting also.
Yes, I agree. I absolutely agree. Yes, sir.
I guess it's an Israeli-based organization called Shurat Hadin, led by a woman whose name is Nitzana Darshan Leitner. And what they do, they have attorneys, both Israeli and non-Israeli, from a variety of countries, that have gone after sources of funding for terrorism and terrorism support. And thus far, they've been very effective around the world in many countries, including even against Saudi Arabian Bank, in getting judgments against a variety of these funding sources. I think, I may be mistaken in the number, but I think it's close to the tune of $100 million in judgments and approximately $1 billion of funds that have been tied up by them. I have no idea. What it sounds to me like is that they've been able to demonstrate the paper trail, so to speak, between the two sources. And there's no energized body yet that you're describing that seems to have figured out and decided to go after such a paper trail with the possibility of demonstrating a connection to not just Sharia law, but in fact funding of actual jihadi elements.
You really need an intelligence operation with an intelligence agency or something on that level involved to really get at the heart of it. I mean, it sounds like they're doing fantastic work, the organizations you're talking about, but I don't think that a nonprofit or a private sector organization here in the United States could make much headway at uncovering this stuff, simply because it's very difficult to pierce the cloak of the Islamic world. And we don't speak the lingo, and we're not welcome. So I think it's a challenge. it's a big challenge. I think the Israelis probably are better positioned and better qualified along these lines than anybody in the world, because they have very good human intelligence in that part of the world. But that's what it takes. I mean, we have satellites. We don't have very good human intelligence. And we have mechanisms of tracking data, evidently. Maybe that can be put to some use. But I mean, this has to be done on an intelligence agency level to really be effective.
How much of the lack of that is associated with not only the Iranian Revolution, but things that took place in places like Lebanon, for example, from the period of the Reagan administration beyond, in which American CIA operatives were captured and probably tortured? And
I don't know. I mean, they lost in Lebanon individuals that had, tremendous experience in that part of the world, and it was irreplaceable. So, but I don't really know the answer to your question. But it's a good question, and you could surmise that it probably had an impact.
Is there a kind of an operative suggestion you can make to us, even though we're a small group and we are not particularly necessarily well connected, of who to write to about things?
On the stuff that I talked about last night, I mean, you can really write your congressman and your senator and express concern about those things. When it comes to Sharia-compliant finance, I mean, if you wrote a letter to your congressman about Sharia-compliant finance, I don't know what impact it would have, to be honest with you. I mean, chances are the staffer that gets the letter is going to look at it and say, "What's that?" And probably going to say, "Well, some kook is writing this about something called Sharia-compliant finance," So, I mean, this presentation really wasn't delivered with, a call to action in mind, because I don't know what the call to action would be. A couple things that we can do is that you can ask your stockbroker, ask your bank, are you Sharia compliant? Now, they're not going to know the answer. Push them. Tell them you want to know. Tell them you want to know. I want to make sure that nothing that I'm involved with has anything to do with anything that's Sharia compliant. On Sharia Finance Watch website, we have a list. It's not exhaustive. It's not all of them, but it's a pretty good list of Sharia-compliant financial institutions here in the United States.
I sent it out.
Okay. Generally speaking, if you do business with the big banks, you're doing business with entities that at least have divisions or products that are Sharia compliant. If you do business with a community bank, the chances of that are a lot less. Same goes with some of the other financial entities. But there's a list there that you can look at. You can try to avoid that, and you can tell people about this. Tell them to try to avoid it. Make sure your stockbroker knows that you're trying to avoid this stuff. Maybe it'll have a little effect. Get on their radar screen. Yes, ma'am.
Would some kind of, I hate to even use the word regulation because we have so many that we have more than we need. But if do you envision that if we could get some kind of regulation for those instruments, financial instruments?
I think that if we could require disclosure, we could require full disclosure on these aspects. True nature of Sharia. Require full disclosure on the backgrounds and writings of the Sharia scholars. Require full disclosure of zakat. Exactly where it's going and to whom. I think we can have an impact on their operations. I think to some extent it will discourage them from operating here, and to some extent it will prevent some of the things that could be going on that are nefarious from going on. If they've got to disclose where the zakat is going, they may decide that it no longer makes sense to give money to a charity that maybe has been fingered as giving money to Hamas, for instance. But right now, those standards of disclosure do not exist. So,
And won't under this administration.
no, and we started this. We started to try to get it under the Bush administration. They didn't have any interest in it either.
During the campaign for the last presidential election, I remember reading that the administration seemed to be involved with and supporting a major meeting with a major Muslim organization, and I believe Nancy Pelosi was the one who was the administration representative in organizing that. Do you know anything?
I'm not familiar with that. I'm just doesn't ring any bells with me. Don't doubt it for a moment, but that doesn't ring any bells. Yes, sir?
You mentioned the enemy threat doctrine. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, that's a good, and I've had people tell me, quit calling Sharia the enemy threat doctrine. Nobody knows what that means. If you look at the Communist Manifesto, kind of like as the doctrine behind communism, Sharia is Islamic doctrine. Sharia is based on the Islamic trilogy, all right? It's based on 3 works: on the Quran, on the Hadiths, which are stories of the life of Muhammad, and the Sirah, which is the biography of the life of Muhammad. And that is the basis for Sharia law, and it's interpreted by Sharia scholars, and it covers everything. It covers what I say to you when you sneeze, and if you sneeze a second time, there's something else that I'm supposed to say to you. It's different from the first time that you sneezed. And if a girl sneezes, there's something different that I'm supposed to say to a girl. In some cases, I'm not supposed to say anything to the girl when she sneezes because I'm not related to her, or something like that. I mean, those are the basic rules on one end of the spectrum when it comes to Sharia. On the other end of the spectrum, literally there are aspects of Sharia that determine the circumstances under which an Islamic state goes to war. So think of everything between what I say to you when you sneeze and the circumstances under which a country like Saudi Arabia or Iran would go to war. Everything in between. I mean, if you get a copy of the Reliance of the Traveler and look at the stuff in here that they have that's covered under Islamic law, I mean, female circumcision's covered in here. Permissible lying is covered in here extensively. There's all kinds of stuff that is covered in Sharia. It is their absolute code of life. It covers everything. It covers this world and the hereafter too. It covers transactions. It covers military operations. It covers their religious rituals, but it also covers their politics and their legal system. It covers everything. So it forms their threat doctrine in that it is Sharia that sets out the requirement for Muslims to spread Islam and to promote Islam by violent jihad if necessary. And there is the problem with Sharia right there, is that is an aspect of Sharia right there that everybody should have a problem with. Under Sharia, they are required to spread Islam by force if necessary. That's the kind of thing that should be disclosed when you go to buy a Sharia-compliant mutual fund. What is Sharia? Well, Sharia's got a lot of different aspects, including it's got a requirement that Muslims wage war against us. They probably wouldn't want to disclose that, but it's in there. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm still just a little fuzzy on the link between Sharia-compliant finance and, sort of the spread of Islam.
Well, here's the thing. What it does is it makes people feel at ease with Sharia. It's one of the ways that Sharia-compliant finance works. A few years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK made an astonishing statement where he said, we're going to need to incorporate aspects of Sharia into British common law. He made that statement, and then he qualified it by saying, it's really no big deal. After all, we already have Sharia-compliant banks and financial institutions, so what's the big deal? So this is kind of a way of desensitizing us to Sharia. Oh, Sharia's no big deal. There's a Sharia bank right down the street. Or I got a friend that invests in a Sharia mutual fund. All that means is that they don't invest in liquor and pornography. You know, it puts us at ease with Sharia and kind of greases the skids, but it also makes us play by their rules to some extent too, as well, because when we want to capture some of those petrodollars and we want them to invest in our projects, you know, it's not like the old days when they would buy an office building and they just buy an office building. Now it's like, I'll buy your office building, but it's going to be Sharia compliant. And the whole thing's going to be Sharia compliant. The transaction and the building is going to be Sharia compliant. We're going to play by their rules. We're going to operate under their laws in order to get that money. And one of the aspects of Sharia that's Sharia-compliant finance that's emerging more and more now is something called the sukuk. It's an Islamic bond. Basically what they've done is they wanted to participate in the debt markets, but they can't because they're not allowed to pay interest or receive interest, right? So they created this Islamic bond, which is a convoluted system of fees and trades and swaps and you name it. And they call it a bond, and it in no way resembles a bond, but they call it a bond. It's just it's a derivative is what it is. It is a derivative financial instrument. And they're starting to issue sovereign sukuk. Yes. All right, so, you know, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, countries like that want to issue sovereign sukuk, no big deal, right? Right, but what we're starting to see now is a movement towards Western countries issuing sovereign sukuk in order to attract petrodollars, essentially. And Britain is very close to doing it. Russia, of all countries, is probably going to issue a sukuk in the not-too-distant future. Some of the Thailand is probably going to issue a sukuk. Japan's talking about issuing a sukuk. Because what's happened here is that these wealthy Islamic nations that have all this wealth from oil and gas, you know, they're no longer willing to invest in conventional financial instruments. They're going to insist that what we offer them comply with their law. And I mean, he's only got 3 years left in office, but I've been convinced that before Barack Obama leaves office, there will at least be a discussion of the U.S. Treasury issuing a sukuk. Because let's face it, we're having trouble getting people to buy our treasuries now. Our Federal Reserve buys most of our treasuries, I think, now. So there's an sukuk, S-U-K-U-K. And essentially, you know, I can see a scenario in which they say this will be a way for us to attract investment from a variety of other nations that, you know, currently aren't willing to invest in our products because of a religious prohibition against interest. So we're going to issue a sukuk. I don't think he has enough time to actually make it happen, and there's no discussion right now of it. But I bet before he leaves office, there'll be a discussion.
There is a bit of discussion, actually.
There is?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that. But, I mean, it's something that I expect. And, you know, and that's camel's nose under the tent.
Thank you very much. Excellent explanation.
Well, sure. Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever looked into whether being Sharia compliant violates any U.S. non-discrimination laws, discrimination against women or other religions or racial discrimination?
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I mean, I think that's an excellent question. One of the things that we'd like to have done is have Sharia declared sedition. And that's a pretty big step. And sedition's, you know, not many people prosecute sedition anymore, but I think a case could be made that Sharia definitely is discriminatory inherently, and if it's applied in certain scenarios, I think there would definitely be a situation where that might occur. And I think that Sharia is also, there are aspects of Sharia that are inherently seditious as well. So I think there are a lot of aspects of Sharia that run contra to both our Constitution and to our laws. And there's a distinction to be made there, because you can violate the Constitution and you can violate laws which are a more minute aspect of our Constitution. And I think Sharia has aspects that do both.
How would you get that by holder? Yeah, right. Ain't gonna happen.
No, won't. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't there any pushback in the name of national security by organizations, governmental bodies, against the Sharia law implementation? Because
Absolutely.
It's a huge threat to national security.
Well, that's what I work on the state level. If you look at how Sharia has embedded itself in host legal systems around the world, it's primarily through family law. And we've developed a law on the state level, which we've passed in several states now, called American Laws for American Courts. And it's my primary responsibility when state legislatures are in session around the country is doing education and outreach on American Laws for American Courts to head off Sharia at the pass on the state level to keep it from embedding itself through family law. Basically what American Laws for American Courts says is that no foreign law will be applied by a court in this state if the application of that foreign law or foreign legal doctrine would result in the violation of any of the parties' individual constitutional rights. It doesn't mention Sharia by name. It's not targeted at Sharia. It's targeted at all foreign laws and foreign legal doctrines only in cases where their application would violate individual constitutional rights, which is how it gets Sharia, because you can start a whole laundry list of ways that Sharia violates individual constitutional rights, and we can start with women right there and family law. So we've passed it now in Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, Oklahoma, Kansas, Washington State, I can't remember off the top of my head. There's a few of them, and we're going to try and pass it in more states this year. I don't think. Oh, we've tried to pass it in other states and it hadn't gotten anywhere. We got it on the. We sent it to the legislature in Michigan, and you can imagine that was rather entertaining. That's not going anywhere. We've had it in several states. We passed it in Missouri, and the governor vetoed it. And then we had an override session, and it failed by one vote to override his veto. We'll be back. He's not going to be governor forever. And the next governor is going to be much better than he is. So we'll try and pass it in Missouri.
And the rationale?
His rationale? Not necessary, discriminates against Muslims, you name it. Just
politically correct.
Absolutely, just gobbledygook. Yes, ma'am.
That's wonderful, but what about the national scope, as far as national security threats?
Well, we got a problem, and his name's Barack Obama. What are you going to get passed right now that's going to do any good? The answer is nothing. The reason we started working heavily on the state level is because we consider Washington, D.C. to essentially be occupied territory now. That's the fact of the matter. There's no law that's going to be passed on the national level. Look, if we could pass laws, requiring this disclosure of Sharia-compliant finance, we'd have pushed for it a long time ago. It's not going to happen. Not as long as he's in office. It's not going anywhere. So,
Could it be an issue to be brought to the forefront now, before the elections to the Congress?
Well, we've been talking about this for years now.
That's the first time I know about it, and I'm sure many people And I follow
So this
the
is a
news
very
and I-
narrow aspect of this overall threat. So, I mean, the overall threat from Sharia is something that needs to be dealt with on the national level. You know, and this is an aspect of it that needs to be dealt with.
And to bring it up so the public will be aware of it in a more significant way could be really significant right now, 2 years before the election.
The public is, I'm sorry, everything is available to the public. We have the internet. If people don't know something today, it's because they don't want to know something. It's all over the internet. There is no reason anymore for anybody to be lacking.
We published a book on this a couple years ago.
The big guns like Wiley and the big guns from Fox News, how come they are not aware of it or don't talk about it?
They have. We've done shows on it, absolutely.
I don't know.
I mean, I was on Glenn Beck myself talking about this when he was on Fox News for a whole hour. You know, we've been on Hannity and talked about it.
I missed it for a second. Did you say that they're going to try to get a foothold with Sharia law in the United States through family law?
Well, that's how it tends to work. That's how it embedded itself in Britain. Because right now in Britain, there are like 85 Sharia courts operating with the full force of British common law. How did that happen? Well, what happened was that when Britain started taking a lot of immigrants from former British colonies, primarily, Muslim, Pakistan, places like that, they started to come over. They asked that they be allowed to govern their personal affairs according to their religious law. British said no problem with that. Well, that's a real problem. You can't have parallel legal systems in a country, because once you start monkeying around with family law, it inevitably spills over into other aspects of the law. Because, there's property issues and succession issues and conflicts and then intermarriage between different religions. Right now, supposedly 15% of the cases that go before these Sharia courts in Great Britain are disputes involving some non-Muslims. How would you feel about going into a court, a Sharia court? You walk in and there's an imam sitting there that's going to judge this case. That happens in Great Britain right now. And it's happened in other parts of Western Europe. Family law is the way that it tends to work its way into a legal system. And so what we do is we work on the state level where family law is decided. So that's the purpose of American Laws from American Courts. Now, American Laws from American Courts works in ways outside of family law as well, but if you look at the number of cases, we did a report on this 2011, which we're in the process of updating now, called Sharia in American Courts. We found 50 sample cases from 23 states involving Sharia in U.S. court systems. And in some cases, U.S. courts actually upheld some Sharia principle on the state level. And these are the only published cases. Only appellate cases are published. Now, I'm not an attorney. This is all new to me in the last couple of years. The trial court cases that don't get published, how many of those happened where maybe there was a bad decision and nobody ever appealed, and and you can go to shariainamericancourts.com and you can read about these cases. Over the last year, we found like 106 more cases in several other states in addition to those 23. Sharia is coming up in our court systems. And if you look at when Sharia comes up, 80% of the cases plus are all family law. Custody, divorces, all that stuff.
How do you reconcile honor killing?
Well, honor killing would be covered under murder statutes, so there's really, you can't reconcile it. No.
You're under a dual system where it's Sharia compliant.
Yeah, I can see your point that, in Pakistan people get away with that stuff based on those things, but over here, that would be covered under murder statutes, I assume. We theoretically should not need a statute to cover honor killing specifically. Although, look, we are actively pushing for anti-FGM statutes around the country. I mean, California, you already have a good one, but there's a lot of states that don't have prohibitions against female genital mutilation. And that's one of the things that we work on. That is an aspect of Sharia. I mean, if you look in the Sharia law text, it's in there. And, it should be covered under child abuse laws and things like that, but it never hurts to put a finer point to the law. And in this case, there is an education and outreach opportunity when you go into a state legislature to pass this kind of stuff, to tell them, this is what it is and this is where it comes from and we need to have a law against it. And, so, I mean, that's something that we work on. We do work on something called Andy's Law, which is something I'm real excited about. Andy's Law is named after a guy named Andy Long. Andy Long was a U.S. Army private. He was murdered outside of a Army recruiting station in Little Rock, Arkansas on June 1st, 2009 by a guy named Carlos Bledsoe, who had converted to Islam at Tennessee State University in Nashville, had traveled to Yemen and attended a terrorist training camp in Yemen, and come back and went on a one-man jihad, essentially. This is another case where they refused the federal government to call it terrorism. And Carlos Bledsoe, who had changed his name to Abdul Hakim Muhammad, he's in jail for life in Arkansas for the murder of Andy Long. But the thing was, Carlos Bledsoe did not come Abdul Hakim Muhammad on his own. I mean, I know his dad well, and I've talked to his dad well. And a guy named Charles Jacobs made a movie about the whole horrible episode. Believe it or not, Andy Long's dad and Carlos Bledsoe's dad are now very, very close friends. The name of the movie, and you should get it, you should hold a showing of this, called Losing Our Sons. It's the name of the movie. And we thought up something that we could do. I mean, Carlos Bledsoe was more than likely radicalized, I would say recruited to jihad, at Tennessee State University, either at the Islamic Center of Nashville, which incidentally was started with seed money by Cat Stevens, and or the Muslim Student Association there that he got involved with. They recruited him and they sent him to Yemen. He didn't all of a sudden just decide. I mean, this is an African American kid from Memphis, Tennessee, who was supposed to major in business at Tennessee State and wasn't there a year before he ends up going off to Yemen to a Al-Qaeda training camp. It didn't just happen on its own. So what Andy's Law does is a couple things. We've passed it in Louisiana and Arkansas, and it's going to be up in Oklahoma and Kansas this year. What it says is that it creates an incentive for a plaintiff's bar to go after anybody who's in material support of an act of terrorism. So in other words, what it does is it sets, it awards attorney's fees and treble damages if you can prove that someone had a role to play in, a crime like this. So you could go, it gives an enterprising plaintiff's attorney an incentive to go look up the Islamic Center of Nashville's skirt to find out what's going on there, or to maybe go look into the Muslim Student Association at Tennessee State University and find out what's going on there, and sue them. And in the process, what they'll do is they'll shut down before they'll be sued, because they can't undergo discovery. I mean, you want to see someone shut down, go sue CARE sometime, because they will not go to discovery, ever. But we've created Andy's Law. It also, in addition to that, at the same time, creates material support for terrorism statutes and anti-terrorism statutes on state level that increase the criminal penalties as well, because what we're seeing is a pattern by the Obama administration of refusing to call terrorist attacks. We all know about Fort Hood, but there was a lesser-known case in Manhattan where a convert to Islam had plotted to blow up a Jewish temple. And the Obama Justice Department declined to prosecute it under terrorism, so the Manhattan DA prosecuted under New York's state-level terrorism statute. And so now 25 states have state-level terrorism statutes. What we want to do is put Andy's law on top of that to make the terrorism statute tougher and also create that civil cause of action, to maybe see if we can't get at them from a different angle as well. Yes, ma'am.
In your view, why does the Obama administration and Holder not want to confront this kind of thing? In other words, how would you explain it?
Well, I mean, all you got to do is look at Holder's reaction when he was asked before a congressional committee if he thought that the Fort Hood shooter was motivated by radical Islam. There's an actual footage of this. And, I mean, he practically went into contortions.
I mean, but why? I mean, is it because they don't want to be, they think it's being politically incorrect? Do they not want to alienate monies coming in from the Islamic world? Or why do they act that way?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, there's a lot of possible explanations.
They favor Islam more than the United States, or
you know, look, it would be pure speculation on my part to assign a particular motivation to why they don't pursue this.
I mean, a lot of people hate them because of it, and I'm just saying, why? What are they? Why are they doing it?
You know,
And no one stands against
I mean,
Holder either.
I think Holder is horrible. I think he's terrible. It just, you know, there's no two ways about it, but I don't know why he got that way. I don't know how he got that way. This is a guy, when he was in college, he was burning down ROTC buildings. I mean, literally, he did that.
Remember, he's from
You know,
Chicago.
I mean, these are the
His cronies.
These are the children of the radical 60s. I mean, these, you know.
I didn't know that.
I just want to point out that this isn't just necessarily something that just popped up once Obama came in, and that Islamic finance has been here well before, and you're not going to be able to find very many instances of even the Bush administration going after Islamic charities or Islamic finance. And there was quite a cozy relationship between many in the Bush administration and Islam in that respect as well. So,
there's no question that that's true. I mean, they held a seminar on Islamic finance at the U.S. Treasury Department.
And unfortunately, it seems like this is a non-partisan issue, right? I mean, this is they're both sides of the coin are.
Our bureaucracy is eaten up with it. You know, the permanent staff, as it were, doesn't seem to. I mean, they've been running influence operations over here for a long time, and they've been very effective. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists have, and we've seen the effect of that. Yes, ma'am?
Based on the separation between state and church and state, how come they could bring in a law, a family law, into the state courts? So, for instance, I'm Jewish, I want a rabbi in the state court to decide my case. I thought it's against the law.
Well, it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more complex than that. A little bit more complex than that, because Sharia isn't just religious. Remember, I mean, to the extent that Sharia covers everything, and if this is the system under which somebody was married, they will try to use the system under which they were married to resolve a conflict. They just happen to be in this country now, so they want the court in this country to apply that foreign law or foreign legal doctrine. And very often, that foreign law or foreign legal doctrine, Sharia, doesn't manifest itself as Sharia. It'll manifest itself as Pakistani law or Saudi law or Egyptian law. It is Sharia, but it doesn't necessarily manifest itself that way when it's brought up in state courts in this country.
So I was married in Israel. Can I request in a state court to resolve my marital issues according to Israeli law?
It happens all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean the judge is going to allow that, but it happens all the time. It happens a lot more than you think, where foreign laws are brought up in state courts for family law conflicts.
Well, we can certainly be reassured since the Obama administration's national security advisor stated that the Muslim Brotherhood is largely a
secular.
organization.
So why don't we stop this, and then we can have some more, finish up those cookies. So
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's turn it off. Thank you.